Over the past month, the Everything Math podcast added 50 new listeners, and the Tuber Gossip podcast, which is all about potato farmers, also added 50 new listeners. So was that good news? Particularly good news for either one of those podcasts? Did they add a lot of new listeners? Well, it depends on the number of new listeners that they started with. Today we'll be talking about something called percent change. So the Everything Math podcast added 50 new listeners. Suppose that to begin with, they had 200. While the Tuber Gossip podcast has 50 new listeners. Out of 2,000 to begin with. In the case of Everything Math, that would be 50 new listeners added. And we want to find that as a percent of the listeners that they had to begin with. So those 50 new listeners are not part of that 200, but we want to know how that number compares to that 200 that they had to start. So 50 new out of an original amount of 200, we could change that to 25 out of 100. So that's going to be 25% of an increase. And when we talk about percent change, we'll always want to say whether that's an increase or a decrease. For Tuber, it was 50 new listeners. And how does that number compare with the 2,000 that they had to begin with? Well, if we reduce that to 5 out of 200, and then to get it to be 100, I need to divide by 2. So this is going to be 2.5 out of 100, and that would be 2.5% increase. So they increased by the same amount, but in terms of a percentage, the Everything Math podcast added a lot more percentage-wise, a 25% increase versus a 2.5% increase. Let's look at a couple other examples of calculating the percent change. There were 80 crows at the picnic tables 5 minutes ago, and now there are 92 crows. What was the percent change in the number of crows? So if I just draw a quick diagram of what's happened here. There were 80 crows a few minutes ago. Now there are 92 crows. The amount of change is not specified, it's not described explicitly in the problem, but we can calculate that quickly. We can see that there are 12 more crows. The original number was 80, and the new number now is 92. The amount of change is 12. When you do percent change, we always find the amount of change out of the original or starting amount. So in this case, the amount of change is 12. The amount that we started with was 80. And Let's see, so 4 goes into both of these, so this is 3/20ths, and this is going to be 15 out of 100. So that would be a 15%, and we'll always say how much this was an increase. So it was a 15% increase out of the 80. One more example. This year there are 24 students on the volleyball team. Last year there were 30 students. What was the percent change in the number of students? Well, we've got 30 minus 24 tells us that the amount of change was 6. And we can draw just a quick diagram. So we had 24 this year. And, now this 30 was last year. So I'm going to actually kind of alter my picture a little bit and write it here. Because this was last year, this is the number that we're changing from. So this time what we're seeing is a decrease. So 60 out of 30, and that would be the same as 2 out of 10, which is 20%. I skipped a step. Let me put that in there. So this would be then, to get it to be 100, it would be 20 out of 100, which would be 20%. So this was a 20% decrease from last year. So you want to pay attention always to which is the actual original number and then how much change. So again, that's change, the amount of change. Over the original or starting amount. That's percent change.